Like parents don't get sex education themselves. They don't get it from anywhere, and then they're expected to teach their kids, and then they're seen as bad parents if they don't do it.
Now, some would be shocked that you're saying that sex education should start from birth or from such a young age. And one of the biggest arguments against sex education is that it encourages children or young people to have sex younger. What do you say to that?
I say that is simply wrong. It does not.
Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. Let's talk about sex education. It's an incredibly divisive topic no matter where you are in the world. And at the heart of the debate is when and how to talk to kids about sex and sexuality. But here's the thing, young people are getting the information anyway through the internet, media, and all other kinds of digital sources that parents and educators aren't able to vet. So, isn't it time to have a real conversation about one of the most fundamental aspects of life? Now, the issue of inadequate sex education is universal, but it is especially prominent in Asia, and Taiwan is no exception. So we went to the streets of Taipei to find out how people are getting their information about sex.
大概我们小学的时候就会，男生间就会开始互开玩笑，就是你的那边怎么样啊？
就是会叫他自己要保护自己。
就是如果没有性教育的话，小朋友获得性的知识都会比较奇怪的渠道，然后那个渠道可能它并不一定是正常的。
Sex education is a divisive topic in many places around the world. It can be especially uncomfortable to discuss in Asia, despite increasingly open societies.
大家比较没有讨论这个事情。
我觉得国小就要开始跟他们说，就是性教育这种东西。
According to a recent report on children's sex education, over 60% of parents in Taiwan don't discuss sex with their children at all, and more than 50% have never even talked to their kids about relationships.
卵巢睾丸就是男生的蛋蛋。它叫什么名字？它在这里，你还不认得字对不对？它叫阴茎。啊，你把阴茎放着。
有一个实体的场域，是家长随时想要跟孩子谈，或是他不知道该怎么做的时候，他来到这里都可以找到他的答案。
今天是要来干嘛的啊？上什么课？男生女生有人知道了。
This is the all-gender nest room run by the Friendly to All co-parenting organisation. It's the first ever children's playground in Taiwan dedicated to sex education. Through paid courses, children are introduced to their first formal sex education class.
我们整个游具呢，其实在象征的是精子跟卵子相遇的故事。然后这个呢，就是象征阴茎。这个球池代表的是卵巢，里面就是每一颗球代表的是卵子。
一个小宝宝要出生了。
讲是一个生命诞生的过程，然后让孩子可以在这个场域，其实他透过游戏，然后透过我们导览员，或是透过家长跟孩子解释这些的过程互动，然后他亲自去体验，当他变成一颗受精卵的时候，他要怎么从子宫孕育长大，然后怎么从妈妈的阴道口生出来。
好，那我就有一个问题了，大家都知道自己是从妈妈的肚子里面生出来的。可是，那你是怎么样跑进妈妈的肚子里的？变天使怎么变呢？
The organisation is trying to fill a gap created by the lack of sex education within Taiwan's formal school system.
You can watch the full version of this feature on our YouTube channel and the TaiwanPlus website. So we got a glimpse of some of the issues surrounding sex education here in Taiwan. And to help us understand the situation elsewhere in Asia, we are joined by June Lo. June is an award-winning sex educator from Malaysia and currently based in Japan. And she has been teaching about sex for over 13 years and is the creator of Good Sex Ed. That's an organization which offers online courses in sex education for children and young adults. June, thank you so much for joining us. You heard those comments there at the top of that report. How unusual are those in Asia, especially in Japan, where you're working from at the moment, and Malaysia, where you're from?
I would say in Malaysia, it's not uncommon at all. It's quite the same. In Japan too, people generally don't receive any sex education from their parents, and the sex education they get in schools is also lacking.
And also in that report, June, we saw a sex education playground here in Taipei that was set up by a group of parents trying to educate their children through play to fill a gap in Taiwan's formal school system. You do something similar. Can you explain why that is necessary and what it is that you do?
So I like to create creative ways to teach sex education. I think the playground is pretty cool. My issue is that there's too much focus on reproduction when we talk about sex education. Sex education should cover a wide range of issues with the goal of helping young people make informed decisions about their adult sex lives and their process of adolescence. What I do is I make videos and I teach online. So I create a space where it's okay to ask questions. And I think if I were to describe what I really do, it would be to encourage young people that it's okay to learn about this topic, to support parents in their journey of educating their kids. Because it's quite a deadly cycle, isn't it? Like, parents don't get sex education themselves. They don't get it from anywhere. And then they're expected to teach their kids. And then they're seen as bad parents if they don't do it. So I think what I do is to get the ball rolling on that process and teach them how to have these conversations.
On the topic of parents, one of the statistics that came out of that report was that around 60% of parents in Taiwanese families don't discuss sex with their children. How unusual is that, or how common would you say that is, especially, let's say, with the younger generation of parents?
There's a lot of people saying that the younger generation of parents are more open to this subject. I have colleagues working on the topic saying that young parents who are unable to teach the subject are reaching out to organizations and professionals who are able to support them. And I've certainly seen that from parents who engage me. In terms of how common it is that parents are not teaching, it is very common. And this is not just because they didn't receive sex education or don't know how to talk about it. I think we need to look at why they weren't taught about sex education. So I'll give you an example. In Malaysia, we have a 70% roughly majority population of Muslims. And Muslim culture or Malay culture in Malaysia is very much about modesty. And there's a concept known as malu. Malu means shame, and it's a virtue to be malu. And to talk openly about sex would be to be immodest, to be not malu. You should be ashamed of talking about sex. If you are not, then there's something wrong with you. You don't fit in. So if you think about that backdrop, that cultural landscape, how are you supposed to teach your kid that and uphold your religious and cultural values at the same time? So the challenge is really to overcome that.
Yeah, I definitely do want to delve into like societal issues and cultural issues or approaches. But we also, I kind of want to move back to one of the points we made earlier when we introduced this topic, and it was talking about how many young people are now getting their sex education online. Christopher Fisher is an associate professor at Victoria University in Melbourne and works in the areas of sexual and public health. His current research centers on Australia's national survey of young people aged between 12 to 20 and their knowledge, behavior, and educational experiences related to sexual health and well-being. Now, he tells us why young Australians are learning about sex online and why it can be an issue.
So I think it's because of the digital landscape where young people are now accessing a lot of their information. And often that's because they're not getting it in schools. They don't get it from parents. They'll talk to their friends, but the friends they know don't necessarily have the most accurate information. And that's where kind of a broader concept of digital literacy is really important to make sure that young people know how to navigate and understand and digest the information and be critical consumers of information that they get on the internet. Because a lot of those media organizations, sensational news organizations will often put information out that's maybe not fully vetted or accurate.
Christopher brought up the term digital literacy. What exactly does that mean, and why is that important when it comes to sex education?
Digital literacy is simply a person's ability to become a critical consumer of information online, to be able to find the answers that they're looking for, to be able to tell fact from fiction, and to find solutions to problems. So this doesn't come naturally to everyone. And you would think, I think a lot of people do think that if young people or people in general use the internet enough, they're going to figure it out. But unfortunately, as Associate Professor Fisher mentioned, there's a lot of fake news out there. And so young people actually need a lot of support. And from the research that we've been doing, we can see that they have developed their own ways of navigating this information. And some of those methods are a little bit unorthodox and frankly a little bit dangerous. For example, they might use like trial and error type methods, testing information that they're not sure about. And that's when it gets really risky for them.
Can you give us an example of how detrimental it can be to be getting, for children to be getting this information online, and also unvetted information?
Yeah, certainly. I'll give you an example. A child faced with an unwanted pregnancy may seek a way to have an abortion. In that search, there have been documented cases of them finding abortion pill suppliers from the black market. And those pills are not abortion pills. For example, in Malaysia, you need 2 drugs to have a medical abortion, and one of them is banned. So it's not possible for them to just buy it from any supplier, yet they will go on Facebook and they will find some person who claims to have a supply of these drugs, and they will buy these drugs. And very often, they don't know how to take them properly. They might bleed out. And there have been cases of people passing away because of this sort of thing.
So there's also the danger of coming across porn or believing that is the education or informative way of finding out about sex. And can you tell us about how that creates these societal issues?
Porn is interesting. There's a lot of people doing research on how porn could be a useful tool for us to teach sex education. Because, for example, for sexual minorities, porn might be the only chance they get to see someone like themselves having sex. However, of course, there are many dangers to porn as well. And the key to porn education is, 1, to have it, and 2 is to encourage multiple narratives of sex and not just show sex as one-dimensional, right? And to be able to dispel those negative messages that you often see in porn, to teach young people, again, to become critical consumers of media and of porn. So some of the things we're seeing is, for example, kids learning terminology from watching porn and using that to search for sexual health information. Personally, I feel that if you look at porn as the enemy, you are really missing out on a teachable moment.
Interesting. I know you said sex education should not just focus on reproductive sex, but that is some of the earliest questions you get, from little children. Where do babies come from? How can, how do mummies have babies? So when should you start teaching children about reproductive sex or the whole idea of where babies come from? And has being in the digital age kind of fast-forwarded that process?
I think definitely it has fast-forwarded the process. Kids are being exposed to a lot more than kids before, and a lot of parents are still giving devices to children without any controls on them. As for when you should start teaching it, I always say that you should start teaching from birth, using the right terminology for genitalia, dispelling gender stereotypes, not doing gender reveal parties because those are dangerous. With reproduction, I start at age 7 or 8, where we start talking about how it all works. We talk about the anatomy, we talk about how babies are made, but all sex education is age-appropriate information, culturally appropriate information that can support the young person. So when we teach sex education, we are always very aware and very responsive. Even if we have a curriculum, even if we have a lesson plan, we have to look at who is in the audience and how we can best serve them.
Now, some would be shocked that you're saying that sex education should start from birth or from such a young age. And one of the biggest arguments against sex education, especially in religious and conservative circles, is that it encourages children or young people to have sex younger. What do you say to that?
I say that is simply wrong. It does not. So we have research showing that comprehensive sex education delays the start of first sex, encourages the use of contraception when they do start having sex, right? So these are positives. And sex education done right does not sexualize the child. I've had many students start at that young age, and I often ask them the exact same question you've asked me, that people who are anti-sex education think that we shouldn't teach you this stuff because you're going to go out and have sex. What do you think about that? And they're just baffled, like, what? Why would I do that? Because you're not just teaching them about sex, you're not just teaching them about reproduction, you're teaching them about responsibility, you're teaching them about life, you're teaching them about having a fulfilling relationship with somebody, looking forward to a wonderful relationship with someone or several people, or the cycle of life and how colorful that can be for them.
So on the topic of how to approach sex education within different cultures, let's hear again from Associate Professor Christopher M. Fisher about why a Western-centric approach does not work for all countries.
I think most education, but particularly with sex education, sexuality education, there needs to be an element of cultural relevance, and particularly for the young people, right? Because if you're speaking to them from a Western-centric approach in a non-Western country, the messages may not resonate with them, right? And that's one of the things we see in kind of broader communication strategies, that you need to make sure that the message that you're delivering to young people to help them learn is in a frame of reference that they can actually understand and conceptualize. And if it's something that goes strongly against, say, a religious or a cultural belief, that message may not land as well. But one of the things I know, some of the work that June has done and has shown that even though it may not necessarily resonate from a cultural or religious perspective, young people are still interested in this information. They're still looking for it. They're still seeking it out.
Right, June. So, societies like Taiwan, East Asia, Japan, parts of East Asia and Japan have quite homogenous societies. Well, you go somewhere, perhaps in South Asia or Malaysia, for instance, and you have a big mix of religions and different kind of cultural approaches. So in a classroom, you'll have a variety of students or a variety of young people. How do you approach then sex education, especially when you're going to have to deal with those sensitivities each person comes with?
That's a really good question. So I don't just teach a Malaysian audience, where a Malaysian classroom would be made up of like at least 3 different ethnic groups, at least. I also teach an international audience, and the world is increasingly multicultural and international. So in a classroom online, people are coming from different countries. Okay, the way that you teach it is to have a solid understanding of your students beforehand. So we spend a lot of time understanding who's coming to class. We spend a lot of time talking to the parents and understanding their concerns. And then we spend a lot of time asking the young people to share their views. So it's not me telling them something, it's me finding out what they would like to learn, finding out where they come from, asking for their perspectives. Because when we talk about culturally appropriate sex education, it's difficult to understand every culture, and it would be a huge challenge to train teachers to understand every culture in the world, right? Even in Malaysia. What you need to teach young people and teachers is an openness to talk about something and openness to receive information. Western guidelines do not apply, and I can give you an example of this. When we teach about periods, okay, many people in Malaysia see the need to wash their disposable sanitary towels. And if you go into a classroom in a more rural area especially, forget about rural area, even urban areas, if you say, that's ridiculous, it's a disposable item and you are wrong, you lose them completely. They shut down, they don't listen to you, you're not relevant to them, right? So you ask them, why do you need to wash this pad? Because it's a disposable item. And then they say, because Satan will feed on my blood. And so then you start talking about things like hygiene. So where do you wash this pad? If you're washing it in a public restroom, doesn't it get everywhere? So you start talking about hygiene and you go, doesn't that make it easier for Satan to find you? If it's all over the place, right? So if you're going to do it, one thing that I can teach you is to do it and don't make a mess. There's ways we can support them. We just need to understand their reasons for doing something and not dismiss it.
Right, and if we look at this in a wider context and perhaps a more abstract concept, for instance, you had mentioned it in previous conversations about the culture in Japan where it's impolite to say no. So how does that translate when it comes to consent or sexual relations?
It makes it very challenging, Divya. That's the long and short of it. If people are generally taught not to disagree, that it's bad to disagree, that you can't say no outright, it's difficult to teach consent. So it means that if you want to maintain this cultural identity of never saying no, then you need to teach it in a different way. So in Japan, where cases, there's your national curriculum, and then you have on the prefectural level people that build curriculum as well that's suitable for their prefecture. Okay, and those guys, there are reports of some guys doing a better job than others. So again, when you talk about cultural relevance, you're also looking at it from a prefectural level, not just a national level, right? So teaching consent in that sense, if you have a high prevalence of rape cases, for example, you would need to figure out a way to talk about boundaries, about respecting each other from a very young age.
The work that you do is very specific and you are reaching a large number of people, but it's often people who come to you asking for that information or for that help. So where do governments come into all of this, and school systems, and what changes need to happen so that this conversation becomes less of what many people see as more of a niche conversation and more of a wider context of as part of an education system or be a bigger part of our education system?
I think the powers that be in governments do have the information. They do know what works in sex education, but it's simply not politically expedient for them to do those things. For example, in Malaysia, this current government is quite anti-LGBT. And so that shuts down all conversations that are inclusive and respectful towards sexual minorities. So how do we then work together? I think they are willing to have conversations. From what I see, they are becoming increasingly open to having these conversations. And I think a compromise needs to be struck. Whereas where we are using inclusive language, for example, we're not preaching the persecution of sexual minorities just because our government takes such a stance. So we can negotiate a more comprehensive curriculum. And some people tell me that you would have to wait for cases of teen pregnancies or baby dumping to spike, and then you have a solution ready and you have the right connection to the right ministry, and then you go in there and go, ta-da, buy my product, which often happens. But you simply can't wait that long. So I feel that these efforts to change the national curriculum, to train all the teachers in our ministry, they need to run parallel to efforts outside of the government. So we talked a lot about digital literacy, for example. We know that young people are looking for information on the internet because they aren't getting it in schools and they aren't getting it at home, right? So we cannot just twiddle our thumbs and wait for the ministry to teach all these topics that are currently not included in the national curriculum. So we can create resources online that are trustworthy and push those and hope that young people use them, encourage young people to use them. I made a sex ed video series on YouTube a few years ago. In fact, it's 10 years ago now. And I still hear doctors in the government system telling me, they'll email me sometimes and say, I don't have time to talk to these young people that come to me. So I just give them your YouTube videos and I tell them, you watch this. we need a reliable source of information that they can turn to.
And finally, you've been doing this for more than a decade. Are you seeing a change systematically, and I'm talking more on a national level or national attitude level, particularly, let's say, I guess it's very different in different parts of Asia, but in Asia, in understanding the importance of opening up and talking about sex and relationships?
Yes, I think the media has helped a lot with that. So when I started my career in this field, it was very much sex education was always followed by the word taboo. So it's always like the taboo subject, sex education, or sex educator June Lau tackles taboo subject. These days, it's just sex education, and they're quite happy to leave it at that. So they've desensitized it to an extent. I would say I haven't seen any major changes in the curriculum or on a national level, but in terms of public acceptance, I think what has happened is we're seeing the effects of a lack of sex education every day in the media. And people are commenting on it a lot more, saying that if you'd only taught these people how to be safe, you wouldn't be looking at these things. We need sex education. We need sex education. So definitely the public is more accepting of sex education, but now we have another problem, which is they need to understand what sex education entails. We need sex education. What does good sex education look like? It's not just, oh, let's do this and exclude all of this. Still won't work.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. June, I'm so glad you've started this conversation with us, but I think there's plenty more to be discussed. Thank you so much, sex educator June Lau, creator of Good Sex Ed, for joining us from Kyoto in Japan. And for our viewers everywhere, it has been good to have your company. If you've enjoyed today's episode or have anything you'd like to add to the dialogue, join the conversation on our social media. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.